Okay, this is Mike Messier with John Hitchcock.
Hello, wrestling fans.
John Hitchcock is a legendary pro wrestling fan, and John, you were really the godfather of, let me see if I got this right, Section D front row, is that right?
Front row Section D.
Front row Section D.
That was the section we sat at in Greensboro,
right,
in the '80s, and it's kind of funny. The reason why we did that is because we needed security,
right?
Because we were crazy, nutty fans that would go to the matches and we would cheer for the heels no matter what.
Big Four Horsemen and Jim Cornette and the Midnight Express fans.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, you know, Ric Flair and Arn Anderson, Tully Blanchard. I mean, how can you go wrong? And Ole, which is arguably one of the greatest interviews that ever lived. But we were right there, and then as it progressed, we were able to get to the front row. Once we got to the front row, then we started holding up signs. And once we started doing the signs, people started getting into the signs, but it drove the regular fans crazy because they all thought that wrestling was totally real, and,
right?
And we're cheering. And so there's I don't want to go into the whole story, but there was one time they had an intermission, and this one lady walked up to me, and she said, "Would you during intermission, I've decided to pray for your soul because there's something wrong with you because you're cheering for Tully and Arn and Flair,
right?"
And I was like, look, you just need to wake up. The best wrestlers in the world, they're the champions. You need to respect the title holders because they represent you, the people. And the lady was just like crazy. And then one lady came up and we were like giving her shit, saying, look, the Horsemen want the girls in the sweaters.
Right.
They don't want the girls like the Rock and Roll Express with the teeny boppers and the training bras. Now, you think we're a genius. No, we just saw that on TV. That's what they used to say. So we would take the interviews, and we would use them against the people. And this lady walks up, and she pulls her sweater up, and she goes, "Are these big enough for you?" and we looked at her and said, "Well, come back. If that's a hope chest, keep hoping.
Wow.
If those are pancakes, you might as well flip them." And we just like giving these people shit. And before we realized that, it became a thing,
right?
And then before you realized that there were people lining up behind us. So Section D became, we were on the front row. We sometimes have 14 or 16 people,
right? And
that first Clash of Champions, we spelled out Cornette across the front.
Oh yeah.
And that was really well received. Jimmy loved it. But anyway, but then suddenly you began to realize that you had 4, 5, 6 rows of smart fans sitting in that section, which means you were protected.
Right,
you were protected because if you had obsessed, face fans, they would throw shit at you, they would hit you, and they would scream at you, and they go nuts. I had one guy pick up a chair and come after me, and I was like, "Calm down, dude. Time out."
At least they believed.
Well, that's kind of gone now, but still, it became a thing, and we were so visually out there with the
suits.
We would wear suits, ties. I always wore a straw hat.
Right.
And then I started wearing a parts unknown hat because I opened up my own business. But the straw hat, of course, was ripped off by the guy at ECW.
ECW, yeah.
He stole the hat.
I've met Hat Guy. He's a nice guy, though.
Yeah. He took that, and I'm like, okay, it's cool.
Yeah.
But it became something, and it built and built and built. And then after a while, it was kind of funny because I had fans calling me on the phone, and they didn't know my name.
Right.
And they would say, "Are you the wrestling guy?" And I would go, "Yeah, man, I'm the wrestling guy." He goes, "Well, what about this?" And I'd explain it to them, and they'd hang up.
Right.
And they started telling people, and they would call me all the time.
Right.
"Are you at the store? Hello? Is this the wrestling guy?" "Yeah, okay." "Is Lex Luger going to win the title?" No, he's not that good. What? Okay. Look, if you have a fixed obsession with a wrestler and you're a fan of that wrestler, if I tell you the truth of what I think, don't get pissed off that I don't like, Flash Funk or something. So give me a break. So it was kind of funny. And then I had fans calling me, and they said, when wrestling started to fall off, and they went from, these are house shows. We would have 12, 14,000 people. It went to like 6,000 and 7,000 and started to fall.
In the early 90s in WCW.
And when that happened, I'd have fans call me and goes, "Are you guys still going to go?" And we're like, "Well, yeah. You going to have posters?" "Yeah." And it says, "Well, if you go, we'll go."
You kept WCW in business.
Well, a little bit.
Bischoff and Russo should have employed you guys, because I remember that you guys were kind of instrumental in the Horsemen initially getting over, I believe.
Well, that was the famous night where we spelled out Horsemen, and we were up in the orange seats.
Right.
And we spelled out Horsemen in big block letters. They were poster board.
Yeah.
And in block letters. And then when Ricky and Robert came out, we flipped it and it said Romper Room.
That's funny.
And because they had said that, you know, big girls in the sweaters, you know, we like, and then they're Romper Room.
Right.
And I was like, okay, that's cool. That's cool. So we started thinking about it, and it was so funny. Back then we had this store. This is another store I used to work at. We had these big counters, and we'd have customers coming in, and we'd say, hey, man, you got an hour? And they go, well, yeah. And we give them a magic marker, and they'd fill in the filling in the thing to spell out Horseman. And so it was so funny. It was so funny. And we got there, and it's the first time we had a separate group who joined our group.
Right.
And that was Dan Grundy and Billy Pritchett and Jimmy Pritchett and Bud Grundy. And they joined our group. And so we had a biggest group we ever had, a Heels fan in one place.
Yeah.
And we knew it was going to be something special because they just done that stupid. Remember that angle where they jumped Ricky Morton and they hit his nose and he wore the tape on his nose? They ground
his face into the ground.
Yeah, ground it. And they had the thing on his
right, the hockey mask type of thing. Yeah.
But he had the tape on his nose. Well, Billy Pritchard and his brother walk up to me and Bud, and they've got pieces of tape, white tape on their nose. You could see it a mile away.
Right.
And they're like, I said, you got any more tape? And they were like, hell yeah. And we all had tape on our noses. And people were coming up to us going, these two people came up and they went, we have one serious question to ask you. And I was like, okay. Are you wearing that tape to support Ricky Morton, or are you basically making fun of Ricky Morton? And we went, you mean Punky and Hoot? They suck. Come on, they suck. They're punching bags. You know, come on. You know, be with real men like the Horsemen. Arnett just called them the Horsemen, but we started going. You know, are you kidding? And people were getting more and more and more angry, and it just kept building and building. And then two of my friends, one was in the press box, and one was over at the other end of the arena with a bunch of the baseball players from the Bats, which is now the Grasshoppers, but. He ran down and said, John, do you know what you're doing? And I'm like, yeah, we're giving these people some shit. You know, they need to be educated. You know, we're the big guys. And and it's so fucking funny. He said, no, John, take a break and look around. I said, okay. And I had guys with me who could talk as much shit as I could, right? So I stand up and I look, and I realize we're surrounded by over 400 people.
Oh, God.
They had 2 intermissions, and both time we were surrounded, and people were yelling and screaming and throwing popcorn and drinks. And there was this one old lady there who didn't have any teeth, and she was chewing gum and grabbing the gum and throwing it at me. I mean, I remember looking at her going, "That's disgusting," you know. I mean, and we just kept stirring it up. And then I looked over, and the wrestlers were coming out during intermission, going, "What the fuck's going on? Look at all these people. What the hell's going on?" And these people were coming in. The wrestlers were watching this heat because it was like you'd never seen. You know, I mentioned to JJ Dillon, he was at that show,
right?
And I said, do you remember the night? And I told him about it, and he goes, I'll never forget that night as long as I live. He said, man, you guys had guts. Nobody had ever done that before. Nobody ever cheered for the Heels before. He said, that was the first time we'd ever seen it. And when it was great, because Tully and JJ and Flair come to the ring, and we hold up Horsemen.
Yep.
And when the Horsemen go up, it's great, because what happens is JJ sees it and goes, oh, my God. And he runs in the ring and goes, Tully, look. And Tully sees it, and Tully goes, oh, that's great. That's great. He got it.
Yeah.
And they run over to Flair, and they tap him on the shoulder and went, look at that shit. Look at that shit. And Flair sees it, and Flair goes, woo, and he does a little dance, and he climbs on the turnbuckle, and he's pointing at us. Yeah. Now, that's the coolest thing ever. You know, those guys acknowledging us.
Right.
But what they're doing is they're putting the heat on us.
Yeah, right.
Because these fans are watching this shit.
Yeah.
And then we flipped over for them. They were going to wrestle Ricky and Robert.
Right.
So we flipped over the sign. It spells out Romper Room.
Oh.
And JJ went, was on the floor, and he jumped up and went, oh, my God. And he runs up, and he shows Tully, and Tully sits on the second turnbuckle and is grabbing his stomach, and he's just laughing and pointing, going, that's the funniest shit. And they show it to Flair, and Flair goes crazy. He goes, yeah. So they went, turn it around. And we were like, no problem. And so, you know, they announce, here comes Ricky and Robert, you know, drummer. They come running in. And it was so fucking funny. And they run in, and they're getting in the ring. They're like, yeah, let's go, rock and roll, you know, rock and roll, brother, rock and roll, and all that shit.
Yeah, all the
and they're out there, and we're standing there, and we got Horsemen. And Tully and Arn, not Arn, but Tully and Flair and JJ just go.
Right.
They point.
Yeah.
And they turn and look, and there it says Horsemen.
Right.
And they're like, what? And then I went, now, We flipped it, romper room. And we did romper room. You can see Ricky and Robert go, oh, shit. What the hell's that? And they're laughing, going, yeah, that's right. We're the Horsemen. You're a bunch of pussies. And they're yelling at them. And the crowd is like, it's cinching up. The crowd's getting more into it. The crowd's getting more fired up. Anyway, they changed the finish of the match and had Tully and Arn win. And then they changed the steps and said that it wasn't for the title.
Oh, okay.
Because we were scared if
Yeah, right.
Tully and Arn lose, these people are going to come down and want a piece of our ass.
Yeah, right.
But they just disappeared.
Luckily, you did not.
It was like a match. It was a match. It was close. I mean, it really was close because we weren't. That's why you explain why do you go to the front row, because there was security.
There you
and
go.
if something happened, you could go, excuse me, security.
Right.
Here's my ticket. I'm on the front row. This joker is obviously lost or confused.
Right.
Get his ass out of here.
Grandma just threw gum at me.
Oh, God.
Now, speaking of which, you have a great store here, parts of the comic book store.
We're celebrating 30 years in August.
That's awesome.
The store's been open.
That's great.
And all we do is sell comics. We don't sell cards or magic or Pokemon or dice or clicks or any of that shit. All we sell is comic books. We've been pure to comic books because I have a passion for it. I've loved it ever since I was a kid.
Yeah.
And I still collect comics and I still love comics. And and that's what we do. And I've been doing this, like I said, it'll be 30 years in August, which is pretty scary because I've been here for 30 years doing this. And of course, we used to have a lot of wrestling paraphernalia up.
Right.
But then what would happen is fans would come in, and before you realize, you'd have, especially on a wrestling night at the Coliseum, you'd have 15, 20 people in the store. They're not buying comics. They just want to talk about wrestling.
They're just looking at stuff.
They just want to talk about wrestling. That's all they want to talk about. And then you're trying to...
Is there crossover from comic? I mean, I'm sure there is, but how much of a crossover between comic fans or graphic novel fans and pro wrestling fans?
Well, that's kind of tough to say, but there is definitely the white hat, black hat, good guy, bad guy thing that goes on in wrestling and goes into comics. So there is that morality play kind of thing. But the magic of comics is the magic of storytelling.
Right.
I mean, great storytellers like Will Eisner or Harvey Kurtzman or Alex Toth, one of those guys who could really tell a story visually. They could break it down panel to panel and take you on this journey. And let's face it, what are the great wrestlers all about? Telling the story.
Telling the story of good versus evil.
Story. And the great ones, greatest tag match I ever saw, Midnight Express with Bobby and Stan with Jimmy versus Tully and Arn and JJ, and it was and they tore the Greensboro Coliseum down.
Yeah.
And that was rare because usually we would have Flair main event all the time. And don't get me wrong, we never complained with that because you got to see the greatest wrestler ever.
Yeah.
But that night they changed it, had those guys in the main event. And they put on, that's the first time I ever called the Observer and said 5 stars. There's never, the timing was perfect. Everything was perfect. Stan was great. Everything was set up beautifully. Everybody played off each other. It was just like bump, that a bump, that a bump, that a bump, that a bump. And you're just like going, holy shit. I mean, it was incredible.
I always think that Sweet Stan Lane kind of gets the short end of the stick. I mean, Jim Cornette always speaks highly and rightfully so of beautiful Bob Eaton's ring work. But I thought Stan was really good. And he also did the thing where Stan would introduce Cornette before their matches.
We once did posters that said the Bobby Eaton, the Rembrandt of wrestling, and the Stan Lane, the Picasso of pugilism.
That's funny.
And Jim Cornette was the Gauguin of Gab. We held those posters up, and they fell out laughing. And then for the whole tour, that's how Cornette introduced themselves.
Oh, that's cool.
As the Picasso of pugilism. And so we always would have fun, but that's the thing about wrestling is you're going to have fun.
Yeah.
And my attitude was, well, I want to be more than just the spectator. I want to somehow be slightly involved in helping to manipulate the crowds, and the best way to do it would be to cheer for the bad guys.
I was listening to kind of an interesting podcast between my buddy Vince Russo and Matt Coon. They were kind of debating fans booing Ronda Rousey. And for me, I don't have a problem with it personally because I think that if you pay for your... Not many people are buying tickets to see Raw in person anymore. But for those that do, if they want to boo Ronda, if they want to boo whoever,
they
can
probably
boo.
wouldn't boo her if she hadn't announced that she's leaving to go have a child and she's going to take a break.
Right.
And they're probably disappointed in that. I mean, there's no bigger star in the women's field than Rousey. I mean, give her credit where credit's due. And also give her a lot of credit for learning how to have better and better matches.
Yeah.
She puts herself more and more in jeopardy. And let's face, in the match, she knows how to work a match. But let's face it, all she has to do is just walk over, bang, bang, arm bar, win every single match just like that if she wanted to.
Right.
Because she, same with Lesnar.
But
Lesnar could do that.
she's having good matches, but I guess
There's nothing wrong with her. There's nothing wrong with her. The new product is. I think the wrestlers now are probably physically more talented than the wrestlers, and they're more athletic than the wrestlers of my generation growing up watching it in the 60s and 70s and 80s.
Right.
But they don't have the characters.
Yeah.
They had back when I was watching wrestling. If Ole Anderson came into the territory, he was a bad guy. If Dusty Rhodes came to the territory, he's a good guy. And you knew that. Not just from the wrestling magazines, but you knew they didn't like each other. And think of the characters, Terry Funk, Stan Hansen. I mean, these guys are well-defined, Buzz Sawyer. These are well-defined characters. Probably part of it is them.
Right.
But they're so well-defined that you throw them in the mix, and it doesn't take long to establish who's on one side and who's on the other and then have the matches. Nowadays, you don't know, we were just talking about this a minute ago, Mike.
Yeah.
But when I was a kid, you could watch one show and you know who's good, who's bad, who doesn't like each other, and what it's building towards. You could figure it out just like that because it's simple.
Yeah.
Keep it simple, stupid.
And
And they don't think like that. They never think like that because they're trying to outguess everybody. They're convinced that the newsletters, the Observer, the Torch, and all that stuff, they're all convinced that that's ruining wrestling.
Right.
But only the people that are obsessed get into it. But that has changed now with being online and being with the computers, because now everybody can get that information rapidly. Just bang, 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 they can get that information.
Everybody's Dave Meltzer now, for better or for worse.
Give Dave his credit. He's the Obi-Wan Kenobi of the wrestling newsletters.
Sure.
He's the guy who's the keeper of the flame. He knows more about everything than just about anybody, except I know more about Mid-Atlantic than his ass because I grew up here and I watched all that shit. But, I have nothing but the highest, absolutely the highest respect for Dave because, he's, besides being knowledgeable, he's a great guy.
Yeah, I've heard good things. Let's take a look at your book real quick,
Sure.
because I know you have customers that are waiting patiently, and thank them for waiting.
Customers? What?
This is your book.
Yeah, this is my book. It's basically, I tell the story. You can get it on Amazon or you can get it here at the store at Parts Unknown.
Yep.
But it's basically my journey as a wrestling fan, being a kid, watching it on television. And then my older brother works at the Coliseum, and he said, hey, you want to go?
Right.
And we jumped in his Volkswagen, and we went to the arena. And he said, there's two things you got to know about wrestling. I said, what's that? And he goes, well, one, it's work.
Yeah.
Okay? They know each other. He worked in the back, and he used to bring beers to Rip Hawk, Sweet Hansen, and shit like that.
Right.
And he said, but the other thing you got to remember is half the enjoyment of wrestling is the fans. You're going to see the nuttiest people, the most obsessed, crazy people, and that's a part of it because they believe it, they're into it. You'll see people you've never seen before, and I swear there's some that look like they came off of tractors, and they walked in and they're chewing tobacco and spitting in cups and shit. And I went, oh really? And I went, yeah. And after my first match, I knew that I was going to be one of those nutty motherfuckers sitting watching it because I was terribly disappointed because my favorite wrestler at the time was the Missouri Mauler, and he was the Eastern Heavyweight Champion,
Right.
and he lost the belt to Danny Miller in the Chicken Wing Crossface, and it pissed me off, even as a little kid, that could happen because the Mauler was really Rip Hawk and Sweet Hansen were the first cool heels,
Right.
But Missouri Mauler was funny as shit. I mean,
Yeah.
he was really funny. And I remember leaving going, damn, that's just not fair. And then I started trying to go whenever I could. But this is what the book's about. It tells you the story of, being a fan, going to the matches, being involved in the matches, and then the whole creation of the front row. And then once the front row hits, once the front row goes, then the signs and all that started building. And then, we were right there for all that Horseman stuff and the Midnight Express and rock and roll, that big feud. And
Bruce Mitchell was one of your kind of the younger members.
Bruce came into wrestling, came into my comic book store at Acme Comics downtown.
Yeah.
And he was the dumbest bastard who ever walked in the store because he didn't know anything. He knew enough about wrestling.
Right.
And then we started talking about wrestling, and he always said I was the first person he ever met who actually was discussing wrestling. Not like, gee, he's going to womp him.
Who's the good guy? Who's the
Was
bad
starting
guy?
to break it down and understand
Yeah.
it. And but no kidding. I mean, he's a real student of the game. He's a real scholar of the game. You can't,
No,
I like to
good.
mess with him all the time because let's face it, he's trouble. But anyway,
Yeah.
but he came in and we said, hey, you want to go to wrestling? And he was living in Beckley, West Virginia, working for Belks Leggett.
Okay.
And he would drive from West Virginia down to Greensboro, and we got him a front row seat.
Before GPS.
Yeah, he come in and he come in and he sit with us, and that was one of the funniest things. He didn't understand the game.
Right.
The game was we had established ourselves as the biggest, as the heel fans that stirred it up.
Yeah.
And he's sitting on the front row as the first time, and he goes, "One thing I always wanted to know: can they hear you?" Now we're on the front row, and they're from here to the wall, right? I mean,
Right.
and I went, "Well, why don't you give it a shot?" Well, he took his first. He made a tactical error,
Right.
Because we've been running a feud with Ricky and Robert forever,
Right.
And so Ricky and Robert come out, and he stands up, and he goes, "Hey, Morton, you suck." And Ricky Morton and Robert Gibson run across the ring, and Ricky Morton says, "Hey, Four Eyes, I've turned down more pussy in one day than you've gotten in your whole fucking life."
And that record still probably
And
stands.
and here's Bruce. Bruce goes, like, "What the fuck?" And I'm like, I can't let that go. You know,
Right.
we got a reputation at the front row of being
Sure.
smartasses and shit. So I went, "Hey, Morton, are we talking legal pussy here? Or are we talking any girls in the training bras and
God.
T-shirts, or any farm animals you might have banged on the way to the arena? Because we're not too sure about you, and you and Ricky and Robert look a little bit too close."
Right.
He lost it. "You son of a bitch!" He lost. He got so fucking mad, and he was. They started the match.
They were from Memphis.
They started the match, and it was so freaking funny because Gibson was in the match wrestling, and Ricky Morton's in his corner. He's screaming at me, "You motherfucker!" He's screaming. I don't remember who was wrestling, but they were laughing like,
Right.
"Oh my god, what a line!" And I don't know where it came from, but it just did. But we were just like yelling, and he's screaming at me the whole match, "You motherfucker!" And I was like, the flashback. Last time I saw Ricky and Robert were in Raleigh at one of the reunion shows.
Right.
They have it at Dorton Arena. It's really cool. It's like going to see the matches, like in one of the strongholds, the Great
Yeah.
Dorton Arena. And it was so funny. I got there and I saw him and I went, "Rock and roll, brother." and Ricky looks at me and he goes, "Oh, Greensboro, come on over here." And he goes, hey, "Oh man, you asshole." And he starts yelling at me and I'm like, yeah, that's true. And he goes, "Hey, Robert, you remember Greensboro?" And Robert goes, "Yeah, it's good to see you, Greensboro." He goes, that guy's the biggest asshole that ever lived. He gave us so much shit. I hate that motherfucker. And he's like laughing. I'm like, "Okay, that's great." And Ricky goes, "Come on, I'll introduce you to somebody." And there's this girl behind the counter, behind his little table.
Right.
And she's sitting there and it's great. She's sitting there and she's going, she goes, Ricky goes, hey, I want to introduce you to Greensboro." They never remember my name. It's just Greensboro.
Right.
He said, "I want to introduce you to Greensboro." And she goes, "This guy right here was in the front row of Greensboro, and he gave us more shit than anybody alive. This guy's the biggest dick. I hate this guy. Everybody, we hated this guy, but now he's our friend." And I looked at the girl, and the girl's face is like this. What? And I looked at her and I shook her hand. I said, "Whatever he said, it was worse." And she started laughing. Ricky's like, "Get the fuck out of here, Greensboro. You're such a dick." And I was like, "Well, thanks. I appreciate that." And I have no problem with being Greensboro.
It's a great
I
city.
love
I mean, I haven't been here in years, but I'm so happy to
I love Greensboro.
check in with the city.
And it was the hotbed, It was the hotbed of Crockett. I mean,
It's a cool city. I mean, they get the minor league. At the time, they had minor league hockey here. I don't know if they still do, but
well, they got the Hurricanes, but that mostly is out of Raleigh now.
yeah.
They got NHL, which is cool. But they still got ACC basketball, which is the best in the world,
But it's home of Starrcade '83 and '84, '85, '86.
I was at Starrcade '83.
That must have been fun.
If you ever see the interview with Dusty Rhodes,
Yep.
and he's standing there and they do an interview,
And the audio goes out,
I'm
yeah.
standing behind him.
Yeah.
The one that works.
Okay.
I'm standing there and I got a dark beard and I'm standing right behind him. And it was really funny because he turns around to leave.
Yeah.
And of all people, he shakes my hand.
That's cool.
And everybody there was like, "Well, why did he shake your hand?" And if you know me, I went, "Well, he remembers we had a feud once in Texas. It was a Texas loser leave town. That's why he's in North Carolina now, because I kicked his ass."
Oh, because you.
And I was a big kid, and these guys were like, "You're a wrestler?" I was like, "You can work everybody,
You can work everybody.
So yeah, it was. It's always wrestling's always been a big part of my life, just as well as comics, obviously. I mean, you can spin around and take a look at all.
Yeah, let's take
got a little bit of everything
You mentioned
here.
Will
Comics,
Eisner has got that beautiful all these things. This is just the store to go to if anyone's in Greensboro, and you're right near
If
the.
you're interested in comics, this is the place to go.
You're right near UNCG now,
Yeah, we're a block and a half from the college, and 2 blocks from Greensboro College, which is cool.
which has got to help with customer flow.
There you go, big man. Yeah. I appreciate your patience.
Yeah, thank you.
I was curious, you don't have your root, do you?
No.
Okay.
I'm here in total. It's one of those things we only got 3 or 4, and for some reason it's all out. So that's cool.
And I literally came in last night just for that and forgot about it. Got distracted.
Well, the new books weren't out for the day, but it did come out today. Maybe next week.
I've never read any about the Venus support because the artist was like Turner Brothers.
Oh, okay.
I just wanted to
That's very cool.
support some pretty decent artists. He did some the Iron Man of Heart was one that I like. So.
Yeah, that's cool. Very cool. Just take a second. Here again. And we try that. There we go. Yeah. Just get your autograph on there, big man. And there we go. Get back next week. Maybe that book will be out by then. Okay.
John, I'm still rolling. Just gonna wrap it up, but I always have the feeling like you're like the one guy where like, you know, pro wrestling's my real passion, but this comic book stuff is like my serious business. It's kind of cool that you pull it off like that.
Let's face it, you got to make a living. You got to make a living, and
most guys are doing like insurance or the 9 to 5, and you're like, I run a comic book store for serious work, but I'm a pro wrestling fan for fun. I love that dichotomy.
Well, it's amazing. It's amazing the people that are comic book fans. I mean, Raven's a big comic book guy.
Oh, Raven! I've worked with Raven a little bit. Raven's a cool guy. Yeah.
There's Tony Schiavone was getting comics for his kids. Was talking about it. That's one thing I did on purpose. Is I misspelled Tony's name every time in my book.
It's a tough one.
Because they always it's not because I didn't know it. It was because they called him something. Every wrestler called him a different name. Mr.
Right.
Schiavone, Tony Schiavone, Tony Schiavone. They called him a different name every time, and I thought that was great because they never got it right.
Giovanni. I was wondering,
But Tony's a really great guy. He started radio here in Greensboro.
and it's good to see him back with a podcast. Here's a Wahoo McDaniel who I actually saw wrestle in North Carolina.
He sent that to us. Wahoo sent that, and then the Flair sent that picture of him. It says to John on the front row, and the other picture is a picture of me with Ray Bradbury, the legendary writer, who's my favorite writer, is Bradbury, and I got my picture made with him a couple times. He was a really, really sweet guy. But if you haven't read Martian Chronicles or Fahrenheit 451, or there's Illustrated Man. I mean, he was like, the guy was a genius, and he loved comics. So he would go to shows. He always went to San Diego, so you could always get a chance to meet him if you were lucky.
I was curious if there's ever, because I have like an Ultimate Warrior comic that I think he helped write or did write altogether.
Oh yeah. The best part of that comic book is to be 6 pages of him ranting about the mushrooms growing out of his fingers. I mean, he was all. It was like the guy wrote this most insane stuff, and they just put it in the book, and you get it. And you just fall out laughing because you're trying to read it. And it was like one of his interviews about the power of the warrior. And every time I look, and it always cracked me up because I'm like, he might have been one of the worst main event wrestlers in the history of mankind. No, I take that back. Diamond Dallas Page was the worst main event wrestler.
You're not a DDP guy.
He sucks ass. He's terrible. He's the most overrated guy ever. He's terrible.
No.
Matter of fact, with the exception of the section of Savage, every WWE, and maybe Bret Hart, maybe a little bit Shawn Michaels, most WWE champions aren't any good. They're not. Compared to Mid-Atlantic, compared to Crockett, when you got the guys they had, the Funks and Briscoe and Nature Boy. I mean, that stuff, it can't be. It would never be top.
I would ask any current wrestling fan who might dispute what you're saying to check into a Jack and Jerry Briscoe versus Steamboat and Youngblood, Starrcade '83, or anything of that era, because the wrestling to me was really great.
Well, I always cheered for the bad guys.
Yeah.
And there's a whole new, and thank God for it, there's a whole new group of wrestling fans coming along from these new generations.
Right.
And they find this stuff on YouTube, and they love it.
Yeah.
Because whenever you go to a big show now, if you go to a comic book show, let's say, for example, Flair will be there or somebody like that, there's lines for him because people know that guy, and they know his raps, and they know his stuff because it's in the network, and it's also on. the WWE Network, and it's also on YouTube. And those people are discovering it, because I have people coming in that are very young.
Yeah.
And they'll come in, they'll start talking it, and I'm like, well, you can talk it, but I lived it. I was there. I was on the front row, buddy. I saw that shit. You know, that night we were talking about the Horseman Romper Room.
Right.
When that shit was over, Jim Crockett ran to the dressing room. And he just basically said, what is this Horseman shit? What the hell is this? He said, man, it's like hot as shit. And they said, well, Arn did an interview calling us the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and those fans grabbed it and they ran with it.
Yeah.
And he goes, well, I don't know where it started. I don't know how it started, but from now on, you guys are the Horsemen. That's it.
Well, we got to make some vitamins. The
I
Horseman.
wish I had some Horseman vitamins. I could use them right now after this rant, you know. But no, it was really sad, because in 1991 in December, they stopped having matches in Greensboro, which was the establishing point, and they took it to Winston-Salem.
Right.
And when they went to Winston-Salem, you think I'm kidding, but they went to the annex, which seated about 1,900 people.
Right.
And we'd go to that and sit on the front row.
Yeah.
And you talk about taking something over. If you can take over the arena and stir it all up when you're talking about 15,000 people, and you go to maybe 1,500 people, shit, it's on, you know.
Yeah.
And we used to have, that was fun, but you could tell that they were trying to go on the cheap. They're just trying to save money.
Right.
They didn't understand the history of Greensboro. They didn't understand how important it was.
I was always pissed that they took Starrcade out of Greensboro for Chicago, and I guess.
You know, on the mothership, the 605, I
Yeah,
sometimes
Brian
do
Last, yeah.
Brian Last, I do. He asked me the question. He said, "Is that really?" I'm not on the screen now.
Oh, okay.
He said that is he said, "Is that true?"
Right.
When, you know, about Starrcade and the fans turning.
Yeah.
And I said, look, everybody was a wrestling fan. Everybody was into it. I mean, you know, it was culturally acceptable to talk about wrestling at any venue.
Right.
It's incredible. But when they had the first couple here, and it was like, it was sold out, everybody's into it and everything. And then when they decided to split it between here and Atlanta, and they tried to split it between here and Chicago,
Right.
you could see the fans go to like 9,000 people, and the Road Warriors are wrestling Tully and Arn in Chicago, and the crowd in Greensboro is down to 9,000, and they're watching all the main events on a screen,
They're not.
and you could see the fans going, "This is an insult to us.
Yeah.
This is an insult." And you could see it in the crowds. The crowd started just turning the TV off, and they started leaving it, and they were incensed, because they were, you know, when I was a kid and I grew up, you know, Thanksgiving, you'd get up. You'd watch the parades. You'd have your turkey. You'd watch the football and see the Lions always lose. Take a nap, get geared up, and go to the Coliseum and check out the show.
Right.
And this was part of our heritage. I mean, it really was. It was, everybody did it. The Coliseum be sold out. You had to get your seats.
Yeah.
And everybody would go. And this went on for years and years and years. We're starting in the '60s. Back in the before the Coliseum was, you know, they used to have it in Lexington.
Right.
But even before that, they used to have wrestling downtown in Greensboro on the roof of the YMCA. And people it was ingrained in them. It was part of their life of going to wrestling. And when they insulted those people by you know, listening to the Road Warriors and Luger going, "We got to be big city. We can't go to these little dinky Greensboro. We look like Hicktown. We got to go to the big cities and make a big splash." They hurt those people's feelings, and they did not come back.
You hurt
They
their
left.
feelings, they hurt their wallet, because you're right, and people don't know that there was wrestling in Greensboro at the Coliseum on Thanksgiving night before Starrcade.
Oh yeah.
People
Well,
don't-
these were house shows.
It was called the Thanksgiving night tradition. Well, it was,
and also on Christmas Eve,
Oh,
either
okay.
Christmas weekend,
Right.
it was another big night.
Right.
But it doesn't take a genius to figure why they go to Greensboro.
Yeah.
You know, they're based out of Charlotte. The
Right.
Charlotte, you know, arena will only sit about, you know, 9,000 people.
Yeah.
You know, Dorton Arena, maybe 8,000 people. Greensboro, 15,500.
and it's
I
centrally
mean,
located.
Jesus, but it's right. It's the biggest. You sell
Yeah.
more tickets. You know, it's financially.
Right, it's
When
great.
they did the first Starrcade, so many people showed up for that they opened up the annex building on the side, put a couple of TVs in there, and they sold $5 a piece, and they sold that out.
That's awesome.
And you're talking about the match, you know, the famous match, the one with Kernodle and Slaughter versus Steamboat and Youngblood, where they had cars backed up for 20, 30 miles coming
Right.
from 220 in Virginia and coming up 4085 from South Carolina, and they had the biggest car mess you've ever seen in your life. They still talk about it because everybody was coming from everywhere to see this stuff, because cable had said this is it, and you knew that was going to be the match.
Yeah.
That was going to end the big feud.
Kernodle had that mask of blood.
Oh, he was a terrific wrestler. I mean, he doesn't get the credit he deserves because he's a very, very talented guy.
There's a lot of guys who, I mean, even my friend Knox Baker was one of those guys that kind of falls through the cracks of. They'll talk about Sergeant Slaughter, and rightfully so, but a guy like Don Kernoodle, who was right there with him for many of those tag team matches with Youngblood and Steamboat, they just kind of forget about him. I guess he did have a WWF run briefly. Kernoodle did in '83.
I think
Just one of those things.
Yeah, people have a shelf life, I guess, but he definitely was the right guy at the right place and time to be with Slaughter. And then they brought in Private Nelson. You remember they had Jim Nelson and he had his head shaved, and he came in, and that worked perfectly too because he looked like a guy that just got out of boot camp because he shaved his head, and he had that big head, but he was a talented guy too.
What is your advice? I do the Mike Messier wrestling rants, and a lot of times I try to.
This is a rant. There's no.
Well, I like it. There's a lot of fans that watch my stuff, even younger people who are kind of getting into them. What do you say to the younger wrestling fans who maybe they're watching WWE Raw and they kind of like, man, this doesn't seem right. This 3-hour show, and we're having all these scripted promos, and some of the matches are just these 6-person tag matches that go nowhere, and our favorite wrestlers from NXT come up to the main roster, they get buried. And do you have any words of encouragement for these younger fans who might be a little disillusioned with the current WWE?
Well, let's face it. There's definitely problems with these storylines from week to week.
Right.
They seem to kind of they go one direction and suddenly goes the other direction. The only time it really makes sense is when they do that build to WrestleMania because they have to. That's the showcase. They have to keep that. They know where they're going to go.
Yeah.
But if I was a young fan, if I was like 15 or 16 years old, I would be on a WWE network. I would pay the $10 and I'd start watching Crockett. I'd watch Bill Watts. I'd watch the Cautionary Tale of the Von Erichs.
Oh yeah.
I'd be watching as much of that the Crockett stuff as I possibly could, and get into the history. Make yourself, become knowledgeable on the history, and have respect for the people that came before, and watch some of that stuff because all that stuff, some of it may be goofy, but it still goes in a direction. It makes sense, and that's really, the wrestlers are some of the greatest athletes in the world. There's no off season.
Yeah.
They work their ass off, but you have to respect them. But then on top of that, if this product now doesn't make any sense, well, that's what EML, AML, the stuff Cody Rhodes and the
AEW,
the Bucks are going to do, and they've got Jericho coming in, and they got some other people coming in. I try to get into that because that's ground zero. That's where it starts, right? Yeah. And then I would I'll tell you something else I would do is if there's an independent show within a half an hour, 45 minutes, if you got transportation, go and support that. You can learn more quicker on a front row of an independent show than anywhere because you can sit right there. The stuff, the CFW out of Gibsonville, you sit $20, you're on the front row, padded seat, all the pizza you can eat, all the soft drinks you can eat, $20, and you can see some of the most amazing stuff. And sometimes they screw up, and sometimes they don't. But, it's a great show. It's worth every penny. It shows at 7, ends at 10, a little after 10. Perfect booking. Everything's great. I would support my local wrestling the best I could, and I would get into the history of it because it's a very, very ripe and fertile area to get into.
Sounds good, John. We'll let you get back to your business. Check out that book one more time.
That's me on the front row.
And people can get
Giving
this.
Dusty Road shit.
Is there a Parts Unknown website, or do you have a website?
We're on Facebook, Parts Unknown website. You can find us there.
I look forward to reading my autographed copy.
There you go. Well, thanks a lot.
John.
Appreciate
Good to
you coming
see you
by.
again, buddy.
Okay, Madman Mike. Take care of yourself, buddy.
Mike Messier, Parts Unknown.